Hello everyone, welcome back to a Flange Time with Flange Master Tal. As always, I hope you all are flanging it up and remembering to bring towels. Today I hope you remember to bring your legal lawsuit towels because that's what we're going to be talking about. The whole Epic Games / Fortnite versus Apple and Google Flange. We're going to be talking about that. And what we're going to be doing, we're going to be trying to summarize a bunch of hours of research to save you that time, explain some lawyer and legal opinions I've been able to gather, and talk about stuff like the possible outcomes and kind of clarify some of the laws at play, and also the stuff like ethical factors and PR maneuvers that Epic is up to. Before we flange onto that topic, I'm going to ask you all to flange up that subscription button down there, hit that bell for notifications. Also check out the live streams. The schedule's easy to find on my social media and everything. And with that, we're going to flange on into the actual topic here. So as we flange up some visual aids and all that good stuff, we're going to get started with, well, how did we get here and where are we at? So we're going to make this possible because a lot of you will already be familiar, but just in case there's people watching that aren't. So this started when Fortnite flanged up what they called the mega drop. They dropped prices everywhere by 20%, made a big deal out of it. But they did something that's explicitly not allowed on the Google and Apple app stores. They allowed an in-app purchase that bypasses 30% cut. But it's a discount that's only 20% off, not 30% off, which we won't really talk about, but it is interesting that they're like, oh, we hate your 30% cut, but we're only going to give a 20% discount and keep that extra 10%. So maybe they're hypothetically being like, we'd rather just give you 10%. That's what that's supposed to represent. Anyways, we're trying to focus right now on just the series of events that got us here. And they flanged that up, and that was a big deal in of itself because people were like, well, this is going to be interesting how this plays out because Google and Apple explicitly do not allow that. There's been issues with all sorts of apps, most notably in recent memory, the xCloud app, not allowed on the Apple Store because of not just the payment reasons, but they're taking exception to all these games, even though they're going to be streamed and not running code locally. And really, it looks like Apple doesn't want xCloud to exist in iOS to compete with Apple Arcade, which we'll touch on later. It's a little bit different with the Android store. There's a little bit more leeway, but it is also explicitly against the terms to allow this. Worth mentioning is also on this note, Linus Tech Tips, if anyone's familiar with them. Great channel, really huge, big fans, highly recommend them. They're trying to create something called Floatplane, which is supposed to be in some degree a competitor to YouTube. They're having a lot of trouble getting their app on the Apple Store. I believe it is on the Google Play Store. So there's a lot of developers that have troubles getting their apps onto the Apple Play Store, even though they are trying to comply and often have to remove a whole bunch of stuff to be able to comply, because App Store is just flat out, you can't even like talk about going to another place to make payments. Like, they're quite strict about it. So now the in-game currency for Fortnite, V-Bucks, is at a permanent discount, and that in of itself was a big move, and people were interested how that would turn out. And how it turned out is they got banned from the Apple App Store. Then they sued Apple immediately. Then after that, Google dropped them from their App Store and also immediately got sued. So immediately, with over 60-page lawsuits alleging antitrust complaints, that it was very clear from the get-go that Epic Game Store, Epic, had been planning this for probably months. They've hired pretty much the best lawyers they could possibly hire from New York, and it's very interesting. So what's also interesting is this was done on all platforms, and PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo haven't really gotten involved in this. They also take a 30% cut. 30% is the industry standard. Although it is an industry standard that came from retail stores with locations that have higher costs, it is the industry standard. There are very few exceptions to 30%, It's pretty much universal. 30% is the cut. It can be argued if that's an appropriate or fair cut. There are efforts to reduce that cut, but at this time, it is the industry standard, which is going to be a big deal. So that's more or less mostly the series of events, but there is more to it. So when Epic got banned from the App Store, they also made a statement about using hashtag free Fortnite and basically directed Fortnite players to hit up Apple on Twitter using the free Fortnite hashtag and try and put pressure on them to allow Fortnite back on the App Store. They also flanged up this video. We'll play it without... Oops, sorry, I forgot to mute that in advance. We'll play it without audio. But this is a parody of a commercial Apple did way back in actually 1984, the year before I was born, where they were basically like, IBM's got the monopoly on personal computers, where Apple were breaking that monopoly, screw all that stuff. And they're basically copying that ad directly, but framing it now like Apple's the big brother with this message. And this is where it gets really interesting, because now we've got another factor where Epic's not just engaging in this lawsuit, but they're trying to create outrage, invoke, or incite outrage amongst Fortnite consumers and players and the gaming community as a whole to put public pressure on Apple. And we'll get more into the ethical ramifications of this, but for now, we'll just make sure to highlight the majority of Fortnite's players are children. There's plenty of adult players. I'm not big into Fortnite myself. It's one of the few games I actually dislike, but it's more kind of like a half joke how I dislike it. Like, when it really comes down to it, if you enjoy Fortnite, I'm totally respect that. I'm totally cool with that. But I might make some like kind of jokes about it and stuff. To me, Fortnite's kind of like pop music where, yeah, it's popular, but it's not popular because it has substance. It's popular because it's formulaic. And that's not the discussion we're here to have, but I will admit to being a little bit biased against Fortnite. And, you know, everyone has their opinions and preferences, but if I put my Fortnite dislike aside, there's a lot of questionable things about how this is going down. But first, I really want to get into the legal aspects before we get into any of the more ethical aspects or parts. So they do try and tell people how they can bypass the ban. They've already installed Fortnite. So they do try and tell people how to get past this. With Google, you can sideload anyways, and it's on the Samsung App Store. So Google does allow competing app stores to a limited extent. There's still restrictions on that. And there's a lot to this. Just another interesting bit is Facebook's jumped in on the dog pile against Apple and Google, and I'm expecting other companies to join in. Other companies have stated their support publicly with Epic doing what they're doing with the lawsuits and everything, and I don't think I explicitly stated it previously so much, but they are antitrust lawsuits, and that is a big deal. Especially since, we'll touch on the articles later, there've been some antitrust congressional hearings and stuff involving a lot of the big tech giants, so it's kind of a hot topic. There's a European Commission investigation. But before we get into any of that, we will quickly, just to help flange up the background here, we will talk about the history behind this in Epic Game Store a little bit before we do dive into the legal things, just so we have a full history and background on this. And yes, this might be a bit of a longer video. There's a lot to cover. I'm going to do my best to make it as concise and brief as possible, but there's just a lot to go over here. So there's just no avoiding kind of a longer video. So strap in and make sure you got your long format content towel flanged up as well. So for a long time, Tim Sweeney has been rallying against Apple and other big companies. Initially, Epic Game Store started up with attacking Steam, and If anyone's read the 48 Laws of Power, I highly recommend it in a self-defense context where you should read the book in a context of learning about power maneuvers unethical people use against ethical people so that you're able to defend against them. Robert Greene wrote the book with that context. He's even got a quote that basically says you can't defend against what you don't know about. That is the whole point of the book. Some people dislike it because of its content and its framing. And, we're not going to get into that. Just the point is, what Tim Sweeney has been playing at is some obvious 48 Laws of Power kind of maneuvers and power plays. So one of the 48 Laws of Power involves attacking a larger, more established entity to make yourself look like the good guy. That's what he's been doing all along. This is, again, what he's doing here. And he's been going at this the whole time. And it's been quite frustrating watching this for me because it's stuff that in isolation I would agree with, but in the context of how the Epic Game Store runs, it becomes more of a mixed bag. So there are legitimate criticisms of Apple and how the Apple Store runs, and some of these criticisms are legitimate, even if they're coming from someone I would personally view as a hypocrite on kind of topics. So valid criticism here. Things get a little bit dicey. I don't think Apple should be getting 30% of tuition if they're doing online classes through an Apple app, like, or not an Apple app, but an app on the Apple iOS store, where they want a 30% cut, and there's some conversations and debates to be had here. So basically, Tim Sweeney's whole approach is trying to frame things like Epic and Tim Sweeney, we're the good guys, we don't want money, this is for the benefit of consumers, we want open platforms, we want everything to be opened up, we want more competition, but Epic Game Store has Epic exclusives. So it's kind of hard for him to go on about this when he owns and runs a game store on PC that has exclusive. So where's the openness there, Tim? So we are getting a bit into the more ethical kind of stuff, although I don't know how much that kind of stuff would impact the court case, although I wouldn't be surprised if Apple and Google just straight up argue, well, you're doing it too, how can you take this position when you're doing it too in your own way? So it's an interesting background when we got Tim Sweeney trying to pretend like he's got a moral high ground, hence the title of this. And, well, does he have a moral high ground? We're going to answer that more later. But just to help frame this when we go into the legal things and get some background, is he's trying to claim a moral high ground. He's trying to claim it's for the benefit of everyone. But that might not be so much so. And we'll start going deeper into this after just covering one more thing in the Twitter, where he's trying to counter where people have been calling out, yeah, he's trying to incite fans and people and players and gamers, etc., to put public pressure on people, weaponizing Fortnite fans, as IGN has stated, and he's trying to say, no, we're not doing this. This is about everyone. We're on a moral high ground here. No, we're not trying to do anything that evil, but their actions speak for themselves, especially when majority of Fortnite players are not adults. So to get into the legal things, we will not be going through the court documents bit by bit or anything. It's just for reference, just going to show them and just mostly just kind of show, there's stuff where Hogue Law is one of my primary references. His videos are awesome. Highly recommend if you do have 3 hours of time to spare. It's like, if you watch all 4 videos he's put out, it's almost 3 hours worth of content, and it's really great, really informative, very interesting, but not everyone has 3 hours to sit through that, where he does kind of go through a lot of stuff line by line. He doesn't go through the whole document, but he goes through a lot of stuff. And a comment he did make, Richard Hogue, the I believe controlling interest in Hogue Law, said this reads more like a PR document than an actual lawsuit. which is very interesting. And I wound up asking him on Twitter. I should have pulled up the tweet, but you can find all my Twitter and tweets and replies easily enough. I asked him about this and kind of was trying to ask, how much will this influence things? And he's basically, this won't really matter to a judge. Also, like the European Commission stuff, basically anything happening in a foreign country doesn't matter to US law. They basically ignore that. They only care about what US law says and what US precedent has been set. So when it comes to a lot of this stuff in the lawsuit where they're building this case, but kind of in a more PR relations kind of way, Richard Hogue stated this is most likely for the benefit of journalists and so on, so that they, to kind of throw out their like really quotable things, and it adds to this kind of aura and whole kind of flange and patois where basically it looks like they're more trying to get public outrage incited here more than trying to pursue the lawsuit necessarily. And it brings about the perception and the speculation that potentially what their real goal here isn't to win the lawsuit. They might not even really care about winning the lawsuit. What they might really want to do is put enough public pressure on Apple and Google to make them change their policies so that Epic Game Store can have their own app store, which is something Devin Nash, excellent industry streamer / he does podcasts too, also has a YouTube channel. If you're into industry stuff, if you're want to get better at content creation and stuff, he's got a great channel. He does lots of great content. But it's interesting because he brought up, well, they're probably doing this because they want to have their own app store, and really their goal is to have their own app store without the 30% cut, probably with their own Epic exclusives, which is hypocritical of them. We'll talk more about that later. Anyways, their end game is probably having their own app store on their own terms on these devices, which, I'm not necessarily against the idea of entities being able to have their own app store, but the way they're going about it is questionable in a lot of ways, I'll say. So what's interesting is, and all respect to Devin Nash, again, he does great content. First one to really point that out or really be like, hey, you realize their end game might be this? What he did miss is it actually says, more so in the Google document, where they talk about, we'll move on to the Google one. So, oh wait, I got them in reverse order. That was the Google one, my bad. So here in the Google one, probably won't find it easily because it's so dense and a lot going on in it. So at some point in the Google one here, it mentions they tried to get an Epic Game Store app on OnePlus devices. And so they pretty much already revealed they have the app already ready to go. They already have the Epic Game Store app for mobile devices ready to go. They were blocked from doing that already by Google, which gets interesting because if you go through the Hogue Law video, he heavily questions the viability of a lot of the arguments and so on. And we'll touch on that shortly. But the point is that actually it turns out that Google blocking the Epic Game Store app on OnePlus devices, and I think also LG devices, if I'm remembering the details on correctly, which I might be fudging that a little bit, that might actually give them more of a case against Google than Apple. Because, and you know what, we'll just get right into that. So just a quick note, while we go past it, is this is a previous lawsuit against Apple that's been going on for like a decade or so, I believe, although the dates are quite recent. Anyways, this was referenced as a lawsuit against Apple, kind of taking a similar kind of approach, but it's been going on for a long time. And the point of this is this whole thing with Apple and Google could drag out for like a decade. This kind of stuff takes a long, long time. And that might be part of Epic's play here of what they're trying to accomplish, or trying to flange up, whatever you want to call it, is they know this will drag out for a long time, and they might be actually going for a settlement more than anything and being like, well, if you guys settle, then we don't got to do this for 10 years, and we got Tencent's 40% investment in us, so, you know, we got the money to just drag this out for 10 years. And I have no doubts in my mind Tencent wants Epic Games to win this. I wouldn't be surprised if Tencent is more heavily involved in making this happen than Epic would ever want anyone to know. That is purely speculation, but it wouldn't surprise me if Tencent's heavily invested and involved in making this happen. And I shouldn't have to say why Tencent would want this to happen. Now, Tencent has more access into devices, etc., etc. So we're going to talk about the current antitrust laws, kind of a rough segue. Briefly go over some important aspects of the antitrust law, and basically I'm repeating what Hogue Law was saying. The Wikipedia article, Wikipedia is like an encyclopedia. It's always a decent reference, but it's never an end point. It's always a beginning point. So Wikipedia is not everything, but it's a good place to start for people that want more understanding. So the main thing we're talking about here is the Sherman Act of 1890. There's other acts. So basically, the FTC. Oh, I got these a little bit out of order. Forgive me. So that's the European Commission stuff. Just a good reference. Not really that important, actually, but kind of interesting. So what we really want to look at here is the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, their information on their website about antitrust laws. So the thing with the Sherman Act is, and it goes over it here somewhat, Hogue Law covers it really, really well in his videos. Basically, the Sherman Act is widely known as one of the worst written laws in American history. It was overly broad, they kind of messed up, and it actually unintentionally effectively outlawed all trade and business. Because the thing is, pretty much everything's a monopoly if you get reductive enough about it. If you sign a contract with an individual to only do business with that individual, that's monopoly. And a lot of people might be like, what? And it's like, well, that's the problem with the Sherman Act, is it basically allowed anything to count as a monopoly, which would mean pretty much anything's not allowed. So the court had to go back later and be like, yeah, that's obviously not the intent. We're going to reinterpret this, do a little bit of rewriting, and basically we're going to change this to mean anything that's unreasonable is not allowed, which makes more sense, but still kind of some issues, because it's like, well, how do you define unreasonable? So we're not going to go too deep into that, but it's important to realize that the Sherman Act does not explicitly ban monopolies. It does not explicitly make all monopolies illegal. It makes monopolies illegal that cause harm to consumers. And that's where it gets interesting with the court case, because Epic has to prove that there's been harm to the consumers with their monopolistic actions, and also monopoly that exists because they're just that good. Their product's so good that no one else wants any other product. That's not a monopoly that's illegal. That's totally legal. If your product is so good that it's just what people use because there's nothing that can compete, that's totally fine and legal and allowed. That's where it gets interesting, because now we have to raise a question, and that'll become the real argument in the courts, at least according to Hogue Law, if I'm interpreting things correctly, of course, that what Apple and Google need to do is to show that how they've been conducting themselves has not been restricting competition and not harmful to consumers. That gets interesting because there are benefits to the walled garden approach of Apple. Google does somewhat have a walled garden of itself, but it's not quite to the extent Apple has it. So Apple's walled garden does have increased security. There's those infamous cases where the FBI had a hard time cracking Apple phones because the security is that good. There's also another factor that I think Mr. Hogue from Hogue Law just didn't really consider, is there could, okay, so let's say it gets to a situation, which is very possible, where the FTC or the courts, not the FTC, the courts, decide, okay, walled gardens, they're harmful to consumers, they're too monopolistic, we're just going to say no walled gardens in any tech at all. Well, that means to allow third parties to create their own operating systems, they're now going to have to reveal secret parts, secret aspects of the operating system and technology to enable people to create these operating. So they're going to have to reveal things that are going to compromise the security of the device as a whole. That's definitely going to be a huge argument being made, is that, well, if we do this, if we just completely open it up to anyone, now we lose all our security. Now it's going to harm the consumer, because the security that benefited the consumer very directly and very truly is going to be gone. So, and then we also get to another thing where we've got like the game console makers, Nintendo, Sony, or Microsoft, with PlayStation, Nintendo, and or Nintendo Switch and Xbox. They're all walled gardens. Now now they have to open things up, and Nintendo notoriously is one of the most intense about it. Is they really do not like homebrew. They really don't want people doing their own things. You can get custom OSs of sorts for various consoles of homebrew operating systems and stuff like that. They hate that. They do everything they can to stop that, and that would prevent them from doing anything about it and actually make it so they would be required to allow that if hypothetically it were to go that far. So things get a little bit squirrely where it actually could harm consumers to completely stop walled gardens. Really, I think what everyone wants here is for Apple just to not be so restrictive and to be a little bit more cool about allowing other apps, and maybe being a little bit flexible about alternate payment methods, and just kind of not be a dick about it, to be colloquial. Anyway, so it's there's a lot of variables, there's a lot of factors, and we can talk about what could happen, what's possible, some of the more tense, bigger possibilities and stuff. But at the end of the day, it really depends on the judge, depends on the government in power, who gets elected with the coming American election. Like, there's so many variables about how this could go in the courts where it's kind of hard to call it, and you can do a lot of speculation, but it only does so much good to speculate about these things when there's just so many variables. But what we do know for sure, at least what I'm able to gather from legal opinions I've read and watched and all that, is it boils down to Epic needs to prove in court that there's harm to consumers and that they're using their market dominance, their power in the market, to prevent competition. Which, that gets interesting, because there are definitely cases where, at least in my view and opinion, I'd say, yeah, they have stifled competition with their market dominance. But then we have another factor where pretty much anyone can make a new phone OS and be like, yo, we got a competitor to Android, and if it's good enough, it'll place Android and iOS, and we'll have like a third one. So when it comes to Apple and Google, they're probably going to argue, well, anyone can just go make a new phone and phone OS and compete with us if they've got the resources, all that, to do it. So it's going to be very interesting where this goes. And really, all what can be firmly commented on is what they're going to need to prove and what kind of arguments they're going to need to make and be successful at making if they want to win. So just to sum it all up before we move on to the more ethical aspects, while I double check my notes that we're not missing anything. Oh, one note I almost missed. So something Epic is doing, we'll flip through a couple pages here that we won't go in depth on, just they're worth noticing. So an interesting detail here is that Epic is also invoking what's called the Cartwright Act in California. California's got some of the most robust consumer protection laws in the US, and potentially they could win on the Cartwright Act allegations in California, but if that only affects business in California, how much does that really matter? It might set a precedent that might create ripple effects, but the thing is, all what they need to do is move out of California, which has high taxes anyways. So, businesses don't necessarily have motivation to be or stay in California in a lot of ways. So they could just move to a different state if they're already in California, and then, it's really federal law matters more. So it's interesting that they're bringing the Cartwright Act into it. They might win on the Cartwright Act, but not win on the Sherman Act, but how much does that really matter if it's California only? So it's interesting. Anyways, so just to sum up, what arguments will they have to make? So legally, does Epic have a high ground? Not really. They have to prove some things that they may or may not be able to prove to a judge's satisfaction, and it really depends on the judge they're talking to. Yeah, they're paying a lot of money for some very high-end lawyers, pretty much the highest end they could buy, but these more emotional kind of rhetorical arguments that they're making in these lawsuits appeal to the public more than they will any judge, because judges aren't supposed to be appealed or motivated by rhetorical arguments. They're supposed to be motivated by what's the law, what's the intent of the law, what's the harm and or benefit to people, businesses, markets, etc. And they're supposed to weigh all these factors, judge them accordingly, and make judgments according to that, and not be swayed by emotional or rhetorical arguments. So they don't really have a legal high ground like they're trying to pretend like they have, or try and frame like they have. They need to prove a lot of things. They need to prove that it's pretty much given that they have a monopoly or duopoly or some significant market power and dominance at the very least. That's not really in question, although the details or specifics, nuances might be a little bit debatable. But there's no question that Google and Apple have massive market dominance. But they have to prove that that market dominance is because they're suppressing competition, and not because they're just so good that that's kind of no one else wants to use anything else. And there have been attempts at competing OSs and stuff, and like Windows phones just didn't really go anywhere because they just weren't that good. And we got having a brain fart. Amazon, they've got their Fire tablets and stuff. They've got their own OS. They've got their own app store. It's not a very good app store because not a lot of people are making apps for it, because all the focus is on Android, because Android's good, and or Apple and iOS is good. That's the thing. There's a lot of things those app stores and devices do, and OSs do, that are just really well done. They've been doing it for a long time, so they've got a bunch of experience, knowledge, etc. They're far from perfect. There's a lot of criticisms that make of both, but there's a reason why it's pretty much Android and Apple, and they're really good. Have they done some things that are anti-competitive? Absolutely. But is it enough to establish that what they're doing has created a situation in which they've stifled competition enough that that's created their market dominance? That's an important nuance, that it's questionable if Epic can prove that, because even though there are cases where I'd say Apple and Google have definitely abused their market power, I don't think they've gone as far as to create a situation in which they have market dominance because of what they've done. I think it is possible for another entry to come in with their own OS for mobile devices and be like, bam, you can install this OS on your Android device, and boom, there you go, you've got a competitor. That won't happen with iOS, and that might work against Apple. But then we got the question of, well, they made this, they can control it, and people are saying, oh, video game consoles are false equivalents because they take losses. The current consoles right now in this generation, Xbox One Xbox One X, PS4 Pro, Nintendo Switch, they're not really taking any significant losses that I'm aware of. They might be breaking even or close to breaking even at worst. The PS4 Pro is actually profitable for Sony. So it's like, yeah, we don't want to get too deep into that, but when it comes to overall, does Epic have a legal high ground? Not so much. Not really. But neither does Google or Apple. They don't really, no one really has a high ground legal. It's just legally, it's really going to depend on the judge and the government in power and a whole bunch of things. How well they can argue to that specific judge that'll be handling the case. Do they go to settlement? So when it comes to legally, it's kind of up in the air. No one's really got a firm high ground or anything. Gonna have to wait and see. But ethically and morally, it gets really interesting because Epic is big on being like, oh, we've got the ethical high ground. We don't want any money. And that's the thing about the court cases, to tie it back into that. They're in the legal cases and all that. They're not claiming any money for damages. They're trying to say, oh, no, judge. And I'm kind of paraphrasing Hogue Law a little bit here. So they're trying to be like, oh, no, judge. Yeah, I got that a little bit out of order. Sorry to interrupt. We should have touched on this a little bit sooner. So just the antitrust hearings against everyone else. So just before we fully transition to the ethics and morals aspect. So with this, bears mentioning that depending on how all these congressional hearing investigation things go, it's quite likely the laws could change just because of this. That Epic's case kind of gets mooted by the results of this stuff. So when it comes to this stuff here, that could have a huge impact and influence on Epic suing Google and Apple. Kind of going to have to see how this goes. And it was an important point Hogue Law made where these congressional hearings, these are what can change the law. But when it comes to the Epic lawsuit against Google and Apple, that won't necessarily change the law so much. These articles are great, but really the main point, this stuff is these antitrust investigations by Congress. These could change the laws in ways that could make the Epic case just kind of not matter. But also it is interesting the timing of when Epic decided to flange this up. I'm sure this timing is no mistake and completely in. So here's an article that interviewed Richard Hogue from Hogue Law. Really good thing, pretty much covered what I talked about. So, you can pretty much read it for yourself. We got to move on to the ethics thing and hopefully not take too much more time wrapping this up. Like I said, just hard to not make this a long video. There's just a lot going on. So, one more quick thing to touch on is there are other lawyers and antitrust experts that are in favor of this. So when it comes to legal opinions, there is not widespread agreement, which just indicates more so to me that it's not certain which way this will go, and it's really kind of depends on who you talk to. So objectively, we should think more about like what kind of arguments, like we were going over before, what kind of arguments they're going to have to make for either side to win. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that we should expect a settlement. And anyways, so on to moral and ethical aspects. There's just a lot of articles about this. It's a lot of information. So when we get to the ethical and moral aspects, Epic's claiming to have a huge moral high ground there. And that's questionable. Like I was saying in the court documents, they're trying to be like, oh no, judge, we don't want any money. We just want to do the right thing. We're not in it for profits. We're not in it for ourselves. we're doing this for everyone. We're doing this for the consumers. We're doing this for the people. We're doing this because it's just the right thing to do. But when they pretty much let it be known, probably unintentionally, and maybe kind of an oversight there on their part, that they've got their own Epic Game Store, App Store ready to go already. And we know because it was blocked, and they let us know because that's one of the arguments against Google. It kind of works against them. Then we got Epic Game Store exclusives for the Epic Game Store on PC, where they're doing what they're arguing against. Like, if they're all for everything open and fair and free competition, well, what in the hell are you doing Epic Game Store exclusives for? Like, it directly contradicts their moral high ground attempt. Not to mention, remember how I was talking about Fortnite's mostly kids? It seems kind of predatory and manipulative. Be like, hey kids, oh, your favorite game's now kicked off your mobile devices that you're playing on. Get all outraged. We want to incite you to outrage so you can put public pressure. Oh, this wait, what? No, these are children. Epic Games. These are freaking kids. They don't have the education and life experience to see through your shit. That's the thing. You go online and there's lots of people. There's a good percentage too that are supporting Epic for various reasons, although there's a lot of people supporting Epic that are like, yeah, we want you to win, but what about this? So there's a lot of everything all over the place, but there is a significant amount of people who definitely tend to more often be adults who are like, hey, we see through your transparent maneuvers. And it does seem like a lot of the people that are just wholeheartedly in support of Epic are kids. So it's not really very ethical to incite a mob of children to go after Apple like that. Besides this whole, like, trying to incite outrage thing, it's a very 48 Laws of Power maneuver, and like I was saying about the book before, that's something you should be reading to defend against these kind of maneuvers, not to engage in them. And when it comes to the whole ethical high ground, they're also trying to be like, well, we offer a 12% cut on our Epic Game Store when pretty much everyone else offers 30, and we can debate if 30 is appropriate because the 30% came from physical storefronts. And then everyone's like, well, they're doing 30%, so we'll do 30% too. So when it comes to them being like, oh, well, 30%'s bullshit, we think that's egregious, too much, well, everyone's doing 30%. There's been a lot of talk, and a lot of people want the percentage to lower and favor developers and so on more. And that's a debate for a whole nother video. That's not what we're here to talk about. But it becomes a false morality play when you realize that Epic's only able to offer 12% because they've got Tencent investment and Fortnite money. Without those two factors, they probably wouldn't be able to afford to. And this is where it gets squirrely and not quite as they're framing it, because they're trying to be like, oh, well, payment processing is only something like 3 point something percent or whatever it is. It's a very low percentage just for payment processing. It's like 3 point something or 2 point something percent plus 30 cents, something like that. Very low. But there's more going on with these entities than just payment processing. They're developing an online storefront. They have to deal with returns and customer support. They have to pay people to build the storefront, etc., etc. Especially when it's like Steam, where it's a very robust storefront, has like review systems and all this stuff. So there's a lot more costs at play here than just the processing. It's very disingenuous for Epic to be like, well, the processing fee is only like 3% and change. The 30% is so much more than 3%. It should be so much lower if the processing fee is only 3 point something percent. It's like, well, hey, that's disingenuous as all hell, Epic. There's a lot more going on, and maybe it should be lower than 30%. But if we're going to have an honest, objective, fact-based conversation about this, we got to talk about the fact that there are more costs in payment processing on here. So it's with Epic, they're trying to play like they're the good guy, and it's like, well, if you guys were taking a more honest, factual approach and not trying to frame things in a way to skew people's perceptions, I'd be on board with them. But when they're basically trying to manipulate people and lie so that people think they're the good guy, I can't support them, even if I do. It's, how do I phrase this? Like, the end result that they're going for, I'm more or less in favor of. And on paper, you think I would support Epic and be like, oh yeah, Epic, I want this to happen. Like, I do want Google and Apple to be checked and put in their place, but not like this. Not with lies, not with deception, not with manipulations, not with incitement to outrage, but with facts, honesty, objectiveness, rationality, not emotional arguments like Epic is using, and also by an entity that actually lives up to an action what it says in principle. And all these things Tim Sweeney says in tweets, it's like, yeah, that's in isolation, they sound great, but in the context of the person saying them and the actions they commit and that their company, that they're CEO of, it just comes off as rank hypocrisy to manipulate public opinion to their advantage. So they want to pretend like they have the moral high ground. They want to convince you that they have the moral high ground. They want to convince you that they're the Obi-Wan Kenobi like in the thumbnail. But are they? I have a hard time saying that they do have a moral high ground when they do unethical things to try and convince people they have a moral high ground. So it becomes one of those nuanced, complicated things where you can't just simply say, oh yeah, this is right, this is wrong. There's a lot of layers and nuances, context to this, where you really got to go through it all to get a good idea of what's going on. And yeah, this video is going to be like a freaking hour long. Like, I was trying to keep this down to like half an hour, but it's just too much to go through. So yeah, basically when it comes to the moral high ground, I don't think Epic has that either. I don't think they have any high ground, which frustrates me because I wish they actually did. Like, for example, if they ended Epic exclusives and were like, we're done with Epic exclusives, any companies we paid for exclusivity, they can just keep it. No more exclusives. They can do whatever they want. They can keep their money. Everyone, no more exclusives. That was a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. It's not congruent with the principles we're trying to adhere to. If they did that, I'd be like, shit, okay, I'm with Epic now. Well, maybe not fully, because there's still some squirrely things. I still don't like how they went about this, but just that alone would do a lot to actually get public opinion on their side and actually give them a real moral high ground. The other factor is the 40% investment from Tencent. They try and say that they don't have any influence, etc., but you don't get 40% investment for nothing. There's going to be strings attached. I mean, that's how that works. So I have a hard time believing Tencent doesn't have an interest or direct involvement in all this going on. And it's pretty clear what Tencent's going to want. They want access to these devices. They want to bypass that. And if Tencent can use this as kind of a back door to get in, well, of course they're going to. Of course they'll be like, hey, Epic will throw some money at you behind the scenes so you can flange up this lawsuit. Like, of course. I mean, why wouldn't they? So when it's known Tencent is got some sort of control, involvement, I don't know what to call it, with the Chinese government, who would definitely benefit from having walled gardens removed, it really takes away from their moral high ground. If they didn't have any involvement with Tencent, it would be a different story. And you know what? Maybe Tencent actually just threw 40% investment at him. It was like, we just want money. We don't want actual control or involvement or anything like that. We don't want your data that, well, no, everyone collects data now. And that's another thing with the data collection. And this is one of the factors where it would be potentially harmful to consumers. Yeah, Apple and Google are already doing it. There's probably some US government backdoors, or I'm not sure, but almost certainly. I think there's even a document. Didn't a document get leaked recently that pretty much confirmed backdoors? Anyways, with Snowden and all that, it's pretty much been well known for a long time what's things going on with the US government to collect data and spy on people. And anyways, when it comes to that, it's wrong, shouldn't be happening, needs to change. But when it comes to, well, it's kind of a shitty false dichotomy, but the reality is like, US government going to spy on us, or is the Chinese government going to spy on us, or there's the Russian government? Maybe other governments too, but those are kind of the three biggest players when it comes to this kind of stuff. If I have to choose between 2 or 3 of those entities, I'll choose US government at any time. And that's and I don't like it, but that's kind of what we're stuck with. So like, I'd rather have the US government spying on me, I guess, if I don't have a choice about it, or have limited choices. But I know I don't want Chinese or Russian government spying on me. And that's why I don't really want things to be just full on wide open, no walled gardens. I want things to be more open than they are. But if we lose walled gardens completely, that can be bad for everyone. And it's one of those kind of balancing acts where you kind of got to find the right balance between walled gardens and restrictiveness and openness, because there's very valid security concerns, not just with your payments, but with your data and information. And that's something way beyond the scope of this video. We're running up on our hard time limit. So it's just, there's just so much to this that really there's just so much more discussion to be had. There's so much more nuance, so much more detail that we just can't cover in a video like this. I could go on for literal hours. Like, if you guys want to hit me up on social media, Twitter, comments here in this video, anything like that, please flange it up. Live streams are probably the best place to hit me up if you want a dynamic, continuing discussion. Twitter's pretty good too. Comments here are pretty good too, of course. But it's a discussion I want to have with y'all. I want to get other people's opinions and thoughts and get more input on this, and try and flesh out and work out my own thoughts and opinions and all that as well. And yeah, it's just, this is one of those really nuanced, tricky, sticky ones where it's best to do our best to start with the facts that we have and know of and go on from there, which is in large part the point of this video, is to have a more firm established grounding of the facts and what is the actual variables at play here. Hopefully I've been able to add that value. Give me a like if I have, thumbs down if I didn't. Had to throw that in there. Anyways, so yeah, it's just one of those ones. We got to wait and see. We got to see where this goes, how this develops. We can speculate all day long, but we can't really read the mind of the judge, that we don't even know which judge is appointed. This could take years. It could be a settlement. I'm pretty sure it'll wind up going to a settlement of one form or another, although that's, of course, completely speculative. And yeah, it's this one thing I can say for certain is this is going to be historical. This will be taught in schools in the future as like a historical part of antitrust law. I did 5 years of school in the States when I was younger, from like age 10 to 15 roughly. Yeah, age 10 to 15. And they taught us about antitrust and all that. They gave us a brief little history and all that of how that went in America. Very interesting to get that education, because I don't think they really cover that so much in Canada. Excuse me, it's been a long time talking. Voice is kind of wearing out a little bit. And yeah. So this will be absolutely historical. This will be a big deal no matter how this goes, and it's quite likely the laws could change to greatly affect the outcome before this all goes down. It's pretty clear what Epic's really playing at. They want their own app store. That's the thing. They basically want to do what Google and Apple are doing, but trying to act like they're not, which is why it's kind of bullshit. So, just stand off. Does Epic have a moral high ground? No, I don't think so. Do they have a legal high ground? No, I don't think so. Could they win this? Yeah, maybe. Could they lose this? Yeah, maybe. Will there be a settlement? Yeah, probably. Will this open up app stores so that it's not quite as restrictive? I really hope so. Will it end walled gardens? I hope it changes walled gardens so they're not quite so high a wall, but I don't want walled gardens to end completely. I do want them to open up, but I don't want a complete end to walled gardens. Because that's there is a value to having a walled garden, but that's a whole separate discussion, and we gotta end it. So I know this went on for a much longer than I was hoping it to go on, but kind of the nature of this kind of topic, there's just a lot to cover and go over. And let me know what y'all think in the comments. Disagree? Do you agree? Do you have an opinion or information that I missed or didn't go over? Do you think I'm just flat out wrong? Do you think I'm right? Let me know in the comments. Flange it up down there. And yeah, as always, keep on flanging it up. Remember to bring hell. Hit that subscribe button. Check out the live streams. All that good stuff. Like and dislike depending on how you feel. Hit that bell for notifications. And I'm back to flanging next week on Monday. Live stream in the morning. We're going to resume the regular 2 or 3 videos per week content, plus the bigger pieces as flanging. And yeah, Flange Master tells, flanging it up as always. As always, flange it up, and remember to bring tell. And I hope I added some value for you all. Have a good one, and bye.